Continuous engineer for the radio station was Fred Ostwald. Fred Ostwald worked at the radio station for 20 years, from 62 to 82. He is the epitome of what I think an engineer in a small radio station like ours had to be. He actually designed from scratch the control boards in the AM and FM control rooms, as well as in the newsroom. He determined one day that he wanted to design an announcer-proof control board. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, the first thing we're going to do is get rid of the patch cords. Nobody ever remembers how to patch around a piece of equipment to bring another piece of equipment online. And I said, well, how are you going to do that? He said, you let me have, and he gave me an amount of money, and I will build a control board, and it will be color coded, so that if somebody calls and says, how do you do this? I'm going to say, well, the dummy punches the blue button on the top right and the white button on the bottom left, and he will get what he's trying to do. And he said, if it's color coded, I can tell them to punch one button in or pull one slide out, and we will get the results. Further, I can also write out the instructions, and they won't have to count off the number of holes on a patch panel to know where to insert the patch jacks. Well, he did that. That was a very far advanced. People came looking at those control boards, and later some of the manufacturers adopted some of the things that he did. Fred had that ability to see a circuit in a magazine or a catalog, and he would either cut it out or diagram it himself. And he had a file folder full of stuff like that. And when he needed a circuit or a design, he knew exactly what he was looking for, and he would simply go do it. That's one of the reasons the downstairs area where he had his office, as you notice, you know from having worked there, there was an office down there. It wasn't just a desk. He had his own office, he had his own file systems, he had his cabinets, and you notice that there were a lot of parts and pieces. One day he said to me, I've got a television set I'm going to bring in, and that's what I'm going to be working on. I said, what you going to be doing with a television set here? He said, we'll take it apart. Why are you taking it apart? There are a lot of screws in that thing that I can use. Do you know I still have a big plastic jar half filled with screws that I brought with me when I left the radio station, that Fred took out of things like that, simply because he knew that the kind of screws used in electronic pieces couldn't be bought at a hardware store. The nature of what went into television sets and radio sets was simply different. He also did something else. When we built the new studios, Fred determined that he wanted to put a thermostat in the main hall. And what he wanted to do was put a cover over it. But a cover that could be accessed, even though it would be locked, it could be accessed. I said, Fred, why do you want to do that? He said, because let me tell you how it works. A woman comes to work, who's one of our employees, she comes to work, and she's wearing a silk dress. And it's a nice day, but the building seems cool to her. She's going to walk over and turn up the heat. Another woman decides to wear a wool suit to work that day. She comes in and she's going to turn down the heat. I said, but if you lock it up, how are they going to do that? He said, I'm going to lock it up in a jacket that has slots on the side, and they will very quickly take a nail file and adjust, and it won't mean anything, but they will think it does, because I will put the real thermostat downstairs, and most people will never know where it is. You and I will, and it's going to be set at a year-round temperature, 72 degrees. He said the other thing we're going to do is we're going to recycle the heat from our transmitters into the building. In the wintertime, we will put the heat in the system because it generates 300 cubic feet a minute at 125 degrees, and we'll recycle the heat. In all the years that he worked at the radio station, I never ever got a heating bill for the 5,000 square feet that we had in that building. It never exceeded $100 a year. I put the difference in his paycheck. Things like that. Things like knowing to put the color of paint in the women's restroom that would keep a woman from staying in there any longer than she had to, because she wouldn't be primping, because no matter what she could do to her face, she had this greenish yellowish tint that was reflected by a fluorescent light over the mirror. And he was right. They spent no more time in that bathroom than necessary, because if they needed to primp and put on their cosmetics, they did it somewhere else. Well, it was a sad day when Fred gave me the word that his wife wanted to move to Phoenix in '82. And the next man that came along as engineering was a fellow by the name of Gene Jones. Jones was a unique individual. This man possessed no less than 5 degrees. He had an electrical engineering degree. He had a degree, a master's degree in education, a master's in theology. I forget what there was another, he had a doctorate degree in divinity, I think, and there was another one. I don't remember what it was. But he was also a unique individual in the fact that Jones was the only man who knew all of the astronauts that ever set foot on the moon, because he was the communications officer. They had to go through him to understand how to communicate from the surface of the moon to their pod, to Houston, and back to their pod, and back to them, because that's how the circuit had to be designed to function. They couldn't talk to each other just on the moon. They had to talk through the lander with Houston and then back, and there was, of course, that delay. Gene Jones was responsible for teaching all those men how to do that, as well as creating and installing the system. Gene was also a lightning expert. He knew more about lightning than anybody else, and that is a real factor with the lunar expeditions that they had, especially when they were on the pad waiting to blast off. Jones one day found himself on the streets of Los Angeles without a job whenever the politicians decided to axe the money they were putting in the space exploration program. Well, his wife was a competent individual in the home mortgage business through a savings and loan. And she came to Salisbury whenever the company that owned the facility down at the corner of East Ennis and I guess it's Long Street. She was the manager of that facility, and so he came with her to this area. He was working as a consultant engineer for William Culpepper out of Greenville, South Carolina. And I had some business with Culpepper and realized that Culpepper was a potential to relocate to Salisbury. Eventually that didn't work out, but that Gene Jones did locate to Salisbury, and he was one of the 2 Jones boys that replaced Fred Oswald. The other one was Doug Jones. Doug Jones was in business for himself down in Meisenheimer and is still living in New London, and is the guy in charge of the electronics at the Albemarle Airport. The two of those men worked along with another young man who was the son of the owner of WHIP in Mooresville, Harrell Hamrick Jr., a very competent engineer who runs his own business today and is now doing a lot of work for the professional teams in Charlotte. I think he works for both the Panthers and the Bobcats on occasion, and he also works for the Charlotte Motor Speedway, Lowe's Motor Speedway. He has his own business. And those were the people who were present up until about the time that I left. Doug Jones was the principal engineer whenever I had a cardiac arrest in October of 1994 and found it in my best interest, according to the cardiologist, that it was, if I wanted to live, the best thing for me to do was to reduce the stress of the 24/7 operation that I had known for nearly 40 years. That's a group of people that were always very important to me. I never ever had a contract engineer. I'd only worked for radio stations that had full-time engineers, and I never understood those people who were willing to work for stations on an as-called business, because all they did was address a problem, they repaired it and left. But I don't know how the stations functioned. I don't know where they found the future in the industry without the kind of day-to-day hands-on that you get from a full-time engineer. Another group of people that I worked with, because I had been a reporter and I understood the role of media, the news media in the community, and the role that radio stations could play with full-time news people. And through the years, I had a lot of turnover in that department, because we had probably one of the better news departments for a small-town radio station in the state. And so people that came in and did a good job, there were stations in the Charlotte and Greensboro, Winston-Salem area that could hear our signal. They knew who was doing what. And so as soon as we knocked the rough edges off of some of them, they moved on to better jobs, both in radio and in some cases in television. One after Ted Austin left and Russell McIntyre was doing the news for a while, and I'm trying to remember who it was that we first replaced Russell McIntyre with, and the name doesn't come to mind right now because it was a short-term deal. But others who came along were Wayne Ashworth. Wayne Ashworth was with us for about 8 years, and he was quite good. He was the first one to successfully use tape. He could tape someone's comments over the telephone, edit and air it almost simultaneously. It was amazing how good he was. He had been in the military, and so we had a mutual understanding in one another. And eventually he was hired away from us by the television station in Winston-Salem, Channel 12. He did a good job for them. However, I think he ran into some internal politics, and so eventually he left the station and became the title of the program, Emergency Services is what it's called in most areas. And he rose to that level in a county north of Winston-Salem, northwest, I forget which one, and came to the attention of the Salisbury-Rowan County Emergency Services people, and